Glasses, really important, getting old. Good morning, everybody. Just a few words about myself to kick off, just elaborating on what's just been said, for those of you that haven't seen my bio. So yes, after a long service in UK intelligence and security, mostly at GCHQ, I now provide cyber advice to a world-leading think tank, the International Institute of Strategic Studies, and advise the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva and a wide range of government and private sector clients in the UK, US, and elsewhere. One of those clients is the set of 5 excellent cybersecurity companies that comprise Shearwater Group PLC, whose chairman, Dave Williams, some of you will know him, is in the audience today, and who is a local businessman who runs a number of different firms across the UK. He invited me here to speak today. I'll say some more about Shearwater later, but this is my first visit to this beautiful island, so I'm delighted to be here for all sorts of reasons. Right, the plan. I'm going to say a few words about the general online or cyber threat landscape, including repeating some of the things the Minister said. Then to my main theme, the cyber dimension to the Russia-Ukraine war, including the considerable risk of spillover onto our networks. Then, having frightened the life out of you with cyber doom and gloom, I will try and shed some light and cover what we can do to best protect ourselves. But even before doing that, a reminder why all of this matters. Our everyday lives in the 21st century will increasingly depend on cyberspace. Already we use it to communicate, build relationships, learn, play, shop, and bank. It already underpins the critical national infrastructure of countries, their agriculture, food distribution, financial services, healthcare, transport, water supply, and energy, and their government interactions with their citizens. It is all already fundamental to the global economy, to international security and influence, and to the global spread of ideas. And in future, many of the things we take for granted in our day-to-day lives will be increasingly connected to the internet as standard, known as the Internet of Things. This means that the functioning of many of your personal belongings, household appliances, vehicles, industries, villages, towns, cities, and islands will fundamentally depend on cyberspace. Those that can properly harness the power of that virtual world will be more innovative and prosperous, with greener and healthier societies. With all of that as backdrop, the security and stability of cyberspace therefore really matter. However, this new world is also used by criminals to defraud, terrorists to radicalize, and by states to spy and to seek strategic advantage over their adversaries and, if necessary, fight them. A few states use it as a means to surveil and repress their citizens. While each of these activities has a parallel real-world dimension, those in the virtual world add a revolutionary degree of speed, scale, and geographic reach. The global coronavirus pandemic, of course, shone a vivid light on all of this. During the pandemic, the internet sustained the fabric of society as we worked, shopped, and interacted with friends and family online. Without the internet, the speed and breadth of the global scientific and medical response to the pandemic would have been impossible. But states use cyber operations to spy on and even disrupt the research into the development of vaccines by other states. And the criminal fraternity, presented with myriad new online opportunities, while also being forced to work from home during periods of national lockdown, became increasingly dependent on cyber rather than physical crime for financial gain. So even before we consider the Ukraine war, the threats to a safe and stable cyberspace are manifold. I will just illustrate with a few examples from the last couple of years, starting with state activity. There was a complex spying operation by a Russian intelligence agency against 9 US government departments and about 100 US companies, which the Russians achieved by infiltrating a US supplier of IT solutions, the Texan software company SolarWinds. Another was undertaken by Chinese state operatives against a similarly extensive and varied set of US targets, and again using the US's own IT supply chain, this time taking advantage of weaknesses in Microsoft Exchange servers. Just last month, we've seen the first time that diplomatic relations have been severed as a result of cyber attacks, with Albania doing so following Iranian hacks. And we're in the midst of an escalating tit-for-tat destructive cyber operations conflict going on between Israel and Iran, which some are describing as cyber war. A less Western-centric selection of media headlines from the same period would include cyber operations conducted by the Chinese military against 200 Japanese companies and research organizations, a series of Chinese cyber operations against the Indian power sector, multiple cyber operations targeting Chinese defense and military units attributed by Chinese cybersecurity firms to India, the targeting by the Chinese of Russian as well as Ukrainian entities during the current war. And all the examples I've given are just the tip of a massive iceberg of cyber operations run by states. There's tons of spying going on. Some states are stealing intellectual property, China doing so on an industrial scale, and some, the Russians in particular, have been trying to disrupt our societies. And cyber criminals. We all recall the media coverage, and the ministers just mentioned it, of that attack conducted by a Russia-based cyber criminal group against Colonial Pipeline. A company that runs the largest oil pipeline system in the US. The company was extorted using ransomware. To explain, ransomware, malware that encrypts and thereby prevents access to the company's critical data until the required ransom amount is paid. And as a result, the company had to shut down its operations for 5 days, leading to temporary fuel shortages across the US East Coast. There was also a criminal ransomware attack on the world's biggest meat producer, the Brazilian company JBS, which temporarily halted operations at its beef processing plants in the US, as well as its facilities in Canada and Australia. There were notable ransomware attacks on a host of other businesses worldwide, large and small, as well as the Irish Health Service, as the Minister said, local government in many countries, and a succession of attacks caused Costa Rica to declare a national emergency. Basically, cyberspace is now the medium of choice for organised financial criminal activity, with the use of ransomware surging since 2017 to become rampant by 2021. I won't bore you with the mind-boggling statistics on how much is going on and how much it is costing, all of them underestimating in my view. But if you speak with the head of the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, she will tell you this is her top priority. And of course, an island like Jersey is an obvious target for financial crime. And then there's Russia-Ukraine. Before I get stuck into assessing and learning lessons from the cyber dimensions of the war, I must note that I fully recognise that this is just one part of a much wider human tragedy where people are being killed daily with missiles, shells, bombs and bullets. I recently appeared on a panel with the head of Ukraine's cybersecurity where it was obviously hard to dispassionately assess what was going on in just the cyber dimension to the Russia-Ukraine war. But that is my task today. What is the cyber dimension to the war? What does it tell us about the nature of 21st century cyber conflict? And what lessons can we draw for our own cybersecurity? Russia's invasion followed an extensive decade-long campaign of cyber operations against Ukraine. In line with published Russian thinking, enshrined in a famous 2013 magazine article by Russia's Chief of the General Staff, General Gerasimov, these were part of a suite of Russian activities designed to coerce Ukraine by destabilizing its government and its ability to function as a state, presumably to increase the chances of a pro-Russian government taking over. The Russians used a variety of cyber techniques, including swamping websites with so much traffic that they crashed, denial of service attacks, website defacement, the hacking and leaking of sensitive information, the ubiquitous use of trolls, online profiles run by humans, and bots, those run by automated processes, to spread disinformation. But the Russians also used highly destructive malware to disrupt parts of Ukraine's national infrastructure. For example, in 2015, they sabotaged the supply of electricity to 250,000 Ukrainians, repeating the operation in 2016. But the most notable example came in 2017, when they used malware known as NotPetya to lock computers in Ukraine's banks, newspapers, electricity companies, National Railway, Postal Service and Health Ministry, and a nuclear facility that we've heard a lot about since, rendering the infected devices completely unusable for the period it took to clean up and rebuild the relevant IT. It was estimated that 10% of all computers in Ukraine were impacted, with 300 Ukrainian companies affected. and because the Russians recklessly used an uncontrolled, self-propagating worm in combination with a widespread coding flaw in ubiquitously used IT known as a global IT vulnerability, they lost control of the operation, with it spreading to damage systems in 60 other countries. The Maersk shipping line was a notable victim. It therefore came as a surprise to many that Russia's subsequent invasion of Ukraine this year did not appear to be accompanied from the outset by Russian cyber operations aimed at extensively disabling Ukraine's critical national infrastructure, leading some commentators to describe it as more a cyber fizzle than a cyber bang. So what did happen? It appears the Russians have been conducting reconnaissance of certain relevant Ukrainian energy and communications networks and been pre-positioning cyber capabilities on them from at least March 2021. But during the invasion itself, and in the few weeks preceding it, the Russians mainly undertook web defacement and denial of service attacks against the websites of Ukrainian government ministries and private sector organisations, with only a few cases detected of malware being used to wipe computer hard drives, resulting in little overall disruption. As an aside, this was all highly reminiscent of the sort of disruptive cyber vandalism Russia had used against Estonia in 2007, and its war with Georgia in 2008, and against Ukraine when it annexed the Crimea in 2014. The Estonian example having been described at the time as more a cyber riot than a military attack. The notable exception was a Russian operation on the 24th of February, less than 1 hour before its invasion of Ukraine, against the European network of Viasat, a US-owned satellite system. This disrupted internet services for several thousand of Viasat's customers in Ukraine, resulting in communications outages in several public authorities and private companies. It also affected tens of thousands of users across Central Europe, for example, disrupting thousands of wind turbines in Germany. The Ukraine described this as a huge loss in communications at the conflict's outset, with targets being the Ukrainian government, armed forces and police entities which relied upon connectivity provided by Viasat. The Viasat hack remains the most significant and successful disabling Russian cyber operation of the war to date. There are several theories as to why the Russian cyber operations may have been relatively restrained at the war's outset. That they anticipated a short, decisive war, where they would quickly capture Kyiv and seize control of Ukraine. So they thought they would need Ukrainian infrastructure themselves. And they were anyway using Ukrainian networks to harvest information on Ukrainian citizens with occupation in mind. Also, they had perhaps learned the lesson of NotPetya and were being careful to avoid any spillover beyond the conflict zone that might lead to an escalation with NATO, with the Viasat hack the exception, presumably because the targets and timing of the attack were so important to their invasion. But they didn't use a NotPetya-like uncontrolled worm and global IT vulnerability. But as the conflict progressed, and especially once their notion of a short, decisive war became untenable, the Russians significantly ratcheted up their cyber targeting of Ukrainian critical national infrastructure, presumably once again trying to destabilize the Ukrainian government and the functioning of the state, as the Russian attention switched back to fighting a more localized war in support of separatists in eastern Ukraine. There have been numerous examples, including attempts against the electric grid using the techniques they had employed in 2015 and 2016, and against Ukrainian telephone and internet service providers. In late April, Microsoft reported that it alone had tracked more than 237 Russian cyber operations against Ukraine since just before the invasion, that some had been successful, with files in hundreds of systems across dozens of organizations in Ukraine permanently destroyed, but most attacks had been repelled. Nevertheless, it was not for want of Russia's trying. The Russian effort to date has been described by US government experts as an enormous cyber offensive, and indeed seems to have been at a scale and frequency far in excess of anything the Russians had previously tried against Ukraine, or anybody else for that matter. The Russians clearly attempted a strategic effect, and are attempting a strategic effect, a cyber bang. But despite some tactical and short-lived successes, they failed to achieve the nationwide disablement of Ukraine that might have been anticipated. Why? I'm going to suggest 4 reasons. The first, since about 2020, and accelerated in the run-up to the invasion and since, Ukrainian cybersecurity has been substantively enhanced by assistance from the US, UK, and other European governments. For example, Since 2020, the US had embedded technical experts within the Ukrainian government to bolster response and recovery capabilities, had deployed software and hardware security solutions into critical infrastructure, and as of December 2021, US Cyber Command deployed experts who, and here I'm quoting, this is all quoting from a US State Department communique, quote, conducted defensive cyber operations against Ukrainian Cyber Command personnel looking for adversary activity and identifying vulnerabilities. Cyber Command also provided remote intelligence, analytic and advisory support from outside Ukraine. There are many other examples of similar sorts of defensive assistance provided by partner governments, including the UK. Secondly, and arguably a game changer, has been the considerable assistance provided to Ukraine by the Western private sector, the likes of Microsoft, Google, and others. Since early 2021, such companies have been monitoring Russian activity on Ukrainian networks, spending vast sums on financial and technical assistance to Ukraine, and been embedding security teams to work closely with Ukrainian government officials, while all the time keeping NATO and European Union cyber officials fully apprised, including with evidence of activity spreading beyond Ukraine. Thirdly, Ukraine's own cybersecurity expertise has been critical. While the Russians have picked up considerable know-how in operating on Ukrainian networks over the years, by the same token, the Ukrainians have learned a great deal about Russian cyber operations. Indeed, it is likely the Ukrainians taught their international partners more about Russian cyber tactics than they learned from those partners. I would add here the attention Ukraine has paid with its partners to improving its ability to recover from and withstand those attacks that get through has been absolutely vital. Its cyber resilience, in other words. For example, Ukraine has been shifting or mirroring data it has identified as critical to its ability to function as a state to cloud services hosted out of country. Ukraine has planned for cyber resilience. Fourthly, it seems Russian offensive cyber prowess is not all it is sometimes cracked up to be. There are several factors to this. One is that the Russian concentration on attacking government networks and critical national infrastructure points to a lack of cyber capabilities needed to surgically disable weapons systems, military units, and dedicated command and control, as US and Allied doctrine envisages being a wartime use of cyber operations. The Russians relying instead on conventional military capabilities to try and do so, small arms, tanks, artillery, bombs, and missiles. Just to unpack this a little further, of all cyber capabilities, those that can surgically go after hardened military targets are probably the most technologically challenging and resource-intensive to produce and use, especially if they are to deliver strategic effects. It may be that Russia, recognizing this, has instead prioritized the comparatively softer set of targets presented by Ukraine's critical national infrastructure. Generally, there is plenty of evidence that Russia knows it is outmatched by the US in this regard, especially since the US-Israeli Stuxnet attack on Iranian centrifuges that were revealed in 2010 and the Snowden revelations of US and allied cyber capabilities in 2013, which probably explains why Russia has been seeking for at least a decade via the UN to ban, under international law, development and use of such military cyber capabilities. Another factor, and I'm quoting senior European cyber officials here, seems to be Russia's failure to wage coordinated cyber and kinetic war, and that its cyber operations against Ukraine were poorly planned and organised. In other words, the integration of cyber operations into the overall military campaign was rarely attempted, and when it was inept, with the Viasat hack again perhaps the single exception. Apparently, in some instances, Russian missile strikes destroyed the very networks their cyber forces were attempting to infiltrate and use as platforms for wider operations. Before moving to identify lessons from all of this, I want to highlight a few other interesting features of the cyber dimension to the war. Firstly, it is easy to home in, as I've just done, on the destructive end of cyber operations and to forget their role in what before and following the invasion has mushroomed to become a massive online information and propaganda skirmish involving Russians, Ukrainians and their sympathizers, referred to as the information war. This has involved all sorts of cyber vandalism, as well as the spreading of fake news and propaganda, and undermining of the adversary's narrative as part of a battle for hearts and minds, with Russia accused of attempting to sow distrust in information sources, misrepresenting Ukrainian actions and promulgating false narratives about the reasons for Russian conduct. To explain, many think offensive cyber covers merely hacking into a network or bombarding it with traffic to stop it from working, and that because such an action is disabling and destructive and often associated with the military, it is tantamount to a kinetic weapon. But cyber operations can also be used to manipulate data and information, or even plant it, influencing the way people think and behave and deceiving or subtly coercing them. We, the UK, with the US and others, predominantly used such cognitive cyber operations to disrupt so-called Islamic State, and they are likely to be the prevalent type of offensive cyber operation in any conflict, including the current Russia-Ukraine war. There are a range of other factors to this information war, including the highly effective release of intelligence by the US and UK to undermine or pre-bunk, as somebody said, the Russian narrative, the Zelensky factor, his ability to rally both Ukrainian resistance and international opinion via the internet, the abundance of intelligence produced by private citizens using drones and mobile phones, and the role of cyber vigilantes, about which more shortly. So some have called this the TikTok war in the same way that the 2011 Arab Spring was described as a Twitter revolution. But most assessments agree Russia has been losing the information war internationally, with no denting of transatlantic coherence and resolve, even if it has been largely able to sustain its domestic narrative due to the level of state control of Russian media. Another interesting feature then, and germane to the information war, has been the sheer number of private volunteer groups and individuals acting largely on their own initiative and often described as cyber vigilantes or hacktivists that have got involved. By May, there were reportedly about 300,000 cyber vigilantes supporting either Russia or Ukraine operating on any given day. Groups such as Network Battalion 65, the Elves, the Cyber Partisans, and the notorious Anonymous Collective, which declared war on Russia at the outset of the invasion, have all supported Ukraine as part of its so-called IT army. This has involved the widespread stealing and leaking of emails, passwords, documents, financial information, and other data from Russian organizations. The result being that in March, Russia-related email credentials leaked online comprised over half the global total and were 5 times higher than they had been 2 months earlier. US-related credentials usually hold the top position. All sorts of material was stolen and publicized. For example, revealing the links between Russian media organizations and Russian intelligence agencies and how they work together to surveil the Russian people. Denial of service attacks and defacing of websites were conducted, for example, on the Kremlin, Russia Today, the TASS news agency, and the video hosting site RuTube. There was hacking into Russian TV channels to post pro-Ukraine content, and disruption of messaging from Russian trolls and bots. Ransomware attacks on Russian government organizations were also prevalent. In one notorious example, a Ukrainian member of a Russia-based cybercriminal group leaked the group's source code for its core hacking program, which was then purloined and modified by Network Battalion 65 to hack into and disrupt Russian state-connected companies. The irony. This has all made Russia currently the most attacked state in cyberspace, and rather laid bare the miserable state of Russia's own cybersecurity, so adding to the sense of Russian cyber prowess being revealed for what it really is. And this is, of course, another golden lesson, understood by all Western cyber experts, that if you're going to be active offensively in cyberspace, you had better make sure you can defend there too. But the involvement of such private actors in a war is also a cause for concern. Given its unpredictability, this level of cyber activity increases the risk of spillover beyond the conflict zone and the possibility of incorrect attribution leading to overreaction, retaliation, and escalation. And it has the propensity for interfering with or impeding Ukraine's and its partners' own cybersecurity, espionage, and other operations, so blue on blue. It also has legal consequences. Private actors may be breaking the domestic law in their home jurisdictions, For example, the Computer Misuse Act in the UK, which government agencies can only contravene when authorised to do so through a judicially reviewed warrant signed by a minister. Or private actors could be characterised under international law as a party to the conflict and therefore legitimate targets for Russian countermeasures. I know the International Committee of the Red Cross, whose primary concern is the potential for harm to civilians in any conflict, is worried about this dimension. If this is a good indication of what future cyber conflicts between states will look like, it is concerning. Finally, the risk of spillover. There have been copious warnings from the US and other governments, and there are several dimensions. Concern that Russia-based criminal groups deliberately do something destructive against Western networks using ransomware, for example, although there are some indications that the Russian state may have tried to rein this in for fear of sparking escalation. Then there is concern that attacks by the Russian state on Ukrainian networks could unintentionally spill over to damage neutral networks, as happened with the Viasat hack. And more latterly, concern about the direct targeting of Western networks by the Russian state in retaliation for the West's imposition of harsh economic sanctions on Russia and its supplying of military equipment to Ukraine. Certainly, there's been a great deal of Russian cyber espionage, with a Microsoft report reporting to evidence that governments, think tanks, companies, and aid groups in 42 countries, 2/3 of them in NATO, the US and Poland in particular, have been targeted since the outbreak of the war. State-sponsored groups have also conducted denial-of-service attacks and web defacements, for example, on Lithuanian websites in late June, in retaliation for Vilnius's decision to stop the transit of some goods to Russia's Kaliningrad enclave, in line with EU sanctions against Russia. But the biggest worry has been the potential use by Russia of destructive malware against the critical infrastructure of targeted neutral states, with intelligence revealed by the US indicating that the Russians are well positioned to do this. For example, Russian malware was discovered in commercial networks supporting the production of liquefied natural gas, malware that could shut down critical machinery, sabotage industrial processes, and disable safety controllers. In June, senior US cybersecurity officials stated they knew the Russians had the capabilities and were actively planning to use them, the only questions being if and when they might ultimately decide to do so. So, drawing on all of the above, how do we characterize the cyber dimension to the Russia-Ukraine war, and what lessons can we draw? Well, we are seeing cyber conflict between two well-matched states. And I say well-matched because Ukrainian cybersecurity, strong in and of itself, is bolstered by partner governments and by private sector companies, while Russian cyber operations aimed at disabling Ukraine's infrastructure, while being copious and determined, have been more poorly run than we might have expected, especially when it comes to synchronization with Russian conventional military operations. I would characterize the resulting cyber conflict, therefore, as highly attritional, with a sustained Russian campaign to hack into and disrupt Ukraine's infrastructure, resulting in intense sparring between offense and defense, but with defense dominating most of the time. Some Russian attacks have succeeded, but their respective impacts have been limited by Ukraine's ability to recover quickly from detected intrusions and by measures it has taken to improve its resilience. But this is only part of the story. Both sides have also suffered unrelenting pressure from cyber vigilantes, and this has put particular pressure on Russian cybersecurity, especially given Russia has no access to the sort of private sector and partner government support provided to Ukraine. Russia is cyber isolated. But we must also remember that the bulk of cyber operations of the current conflict are likely designed for influence and other cognitive effects as part of the information war rather than the destructive types I've mostly highlighted. And here, Russia has a stronger track record of integrating cyber operations with its other means of disinformation. Further, while we may now have a better understanding of the cyber dimension of modern war, we must be very careful not to jump to conclusions too soon. Firstly, we must remember that the war is only 7 months old, that the planning of sophisticated cyber operations takes time, and therefore the dynamics of the cyber conflict may change over time. And we should also note that in a future conflict, it might not be so morally straightforward for large global tech companies like Microsoft and Google to choose a side. And in future, there may generally be a more concerted effort to discourage the involvement of private civilian actors in a war, lest they begin to be treated by belligerents like virtual mercenaries, i.e., in the same way that mercenaries on the physical battlefield are treated. Generally, the current war, as I've said, illustrates the obvious risk that in any conflict, the use of cyber operations might inadvertently, let alone deliberately, lead to escalation of the conflict. So far, it appears Russia has been trying to minimize the chances of this happening to avoid sparking an escalation. But it is also worrying that Moscow still envisages the deliberate use of such operations beyond the conflict zone, presumably in extremis, and has been pre-positioning relevant capabilities. Although, think about it, they're clearly being detected by Western cybersecurity. The degree to which destructive Russian cyber operations beyond the conflict zone may be being deterred is an interesting one. It was perhaps significant that last year there seemed to be two clear deterrent warnings given by the US and its allies to potential cyber adversaries. President Biden highlighted that a cyber breach would be the most likely cause of the US finding itself in, I quote, a real shooting war with a major power. And NATO clarified that it would judge on a case-by-case basis whether a cyber attack against any of the allied states might cross the Article 5 threshold for collective response, and that it would also consider an accumulation over time of more minor attacks as potentially crossing that threshold. Those were clear messages. Beyond this, though, there is an international legal issue. Everyone is agreed that existing international law applies to cyberspace, but there is ongoing uncertainty as precisely how it applies in both war and peace, something highlighted recently by the UK Attorney General, specifically leading to fuzziness over the nature of the cyber activity that would cross legal thresholds to become internationally wrongful acts and therefore trigger legitimate countermeasures. It is getting plenty of attention from states, the UK being one amongst a number of them, to signal its interpretation of the application of international law and, building on that, what it means to be a responsible and democratic cyber actor. But this is a complex issue. We knew before the war that far greater efforts were needed nationally and internationally to agree and define what constitutes a responsible use of cyber power, with abiding by international law at its heart, and the war has made those efforts even more urgent. But there is one other big and helpful lesson from the cyber dimension to the war, and I'll signal this as the moment to start shining light on doom and gloom. All governments, including those of islands like Jersey, and all company boards, should note the way Ukraine has so far defended itself so effectively in cyberspace. I'm just going to list 5 primary components. Firstly, Ukraine treated cybersecurity at the level of a national risk, not merely as a technical issue to be left to technical people. Applying this to companies, I would argue that this is the equivalent of bridging the gap, even the language barrier, that often exists in companies between the level of Chief Information and Security Officer, CISO, and the board, recognizing that cybersecurity is mostly about people and processes, leadership, governance, risk management, and training, and doesn't have to get lost in the, albeit very real, technical complexities. Secondly, Ukraine treated cybersecurity as a team sport, reaching out to experts in partner governments and the private sector for help, with the mutual sharing of information, intelligence, and experience a sine qua non. Thirdly, Ukraine recognized the importance of assiduously implementing basic cybersecurity on its networks. Some call this cyber hygiene. This is not rocket science, and as the adage goes, prevents 95% of the malicious stuff coming your way. It is about being up to date with patching, using proper access controls like multi-factor authentication, having good password protocols, good network monitoring, engaging staff on the phishing threat, using third-party audits, and demanding to see evidence of such from your suppliers, a basic supply chain point, and the like. I could list the damage done by cyber attacks like SolarWinds, NotPetya, the North Korean use of WannaCry in 2017, and numerous ransomware attacks that would have been limited or even curtailed had basic cybersecurity measures been in place. Fourthly, Ukraine put in measures to cope with 5% of the attacks that might get through. It had good recovery plans and, crucially, has built resilience into how it stores critical data. If a country can think about which data matters most to it and then treat it in a different way from the rest, so can a company. Fifthly, and finally, Ukraine had years of practice from which it clearly learned, even if it involved learning the hard way. Governments and companies can, of course, choose to learn the easier way by making sure that a real ransomware attack, for example, is not the first time they test their people and processes in responding and recovering to a cyber crisis. Practice makes perfect, so exercise, test how you will deal with a major breach before it happens. Now, there is help to be found in the cybersecurity industrial sector on all 5 of the things I've outlined above. But it is undoubtedly a crowded and confusing marketplace. There are a lot of companies covering different bits and pieces of the cybersecurity jigsaw, often in confusingly different ways, which is why I think a company like Shearwater Group is so important, because it is a consolidator, bringing a range of companies together that cover the various people, process, and technical dimensions of the 5 things I've highlighted to create an excellent one-stop shop for cybersecurity support. It is why I'm pleased to sit on Shearwater's advisory panel. There are so many cyber questions that I haven't covered. What is responsible and democratic cyber power then? That's a very long answer. How does deterrence work in cyberspace really then? That's an even longer answer. What is the strategic solution for tackling cybercrime? Where does the insurance industry fit into all of this? Positively. That's to name but 4, but there isn't time. So in conclusion, all the warnings from governments about the risk of cyber spillover from the war all sound dramatic, with the US, for example, demanding a shields-up response. But the 5 things I've outlined above are what shields up really means. It is not easy, but it is eminently doable and practical, provided governments and boards are able to ask the right questions and have the right conversations. There is plenty of help out there, but a good place to start is to think, what did Ukraine do? Because it has so far been able to withstand a massive cyber bombardment from one of the world's most cyber-capable states, which in and of itself is highly instructive. Thank you. That's all I'm going to say. Have we got time?
Absolutely.
If we've got time, go for it.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we do have a little time, so if anyone would like to pose a question to Marcus, you will be more than welcome to do so. Andre.
Just a quick question. One of my little pet loves is OSINT. How important was OSINT in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict? I see 1.5 tons of information being collated by some of these independents, as you refer to them, some of these sort of home cyber warriors. And that is becoming crucial from my view of what's going on in that particular conflict. Are governments really using as much of that stuff as is available?
So firstly, I agree. It's been absolutely crucial. And yes, we're in a situation where situational awareness is provided by people taking photographs of military units on their mobile phones or personally flying drones. And I think governments learnt a long time ago to marry that sort of open source intelligence with their secret stuff and stuff that companies can get. That's the best way of getting an integrated picture of what's going on. What I was saying, though, is it has to be done carefully, and there is obviously risk with civilians doing that sort of thing that they could get themselves. This is what the International Committee of the Red Cross are concerned about. They could, in some way, get themselves involved in the conflict. But that open source intelligence has been absolutely crucial, as has all sorts of open source intelligence groups, companies that take that information and assess it and produce product from it. So vital.
I've seen some of the commercial businesses actually putting out information collation techniques for their tools to enable individuals to identify things such as movements of Russian troops, vehicles, and what else. And those seem to be being collated by other groups for other reasons.
Yeah, I think talking about the cyber dimension of what future conflict will look like. It's not just cyber here. I think. Assessing what that would mean for future conflict, because it looks like it's going to be an obvious part of any future conflict, is really important. So I think I'm basically agreeing with you, I think.
Anyone else with a question? Paul?
You mentioned things like the Ukrainian cyber army attacking and leaking documentations. I'm interested in what your thoughts would be assuming the war finishes, post that, and the effect on Russian industry as a result of those sort of actions?
Yeah, so I'm sure Russia is watching all this. What's happening in Ukraine, probably listening to what I'm saying, and thinking, what do they do in future? There's one really important bit. You mentioned Russian industry. There's been an embargo of advanced digital technical products to Russia, including US advanced chip technology, that even China is desperately trying to adhere to. So Chinese imports into Russia of digital technology have all dropped. There are long-term consequences for Russia's ability to develop advanced capabilities, including cyber capabilities, because of that reliance on Western advanced digital technology, and particularly microchips. So I think, of all the sanctions that in terms of long-term effect, and don't forget that affects Russia's ability to develop artificial intelligence. And Putin said in 2017 that whoever leads on developing artificial intelligence will, and it shows you a bit about his mentality, will, quote, rule the world. Well, I mean, Russia's going to be way behind on that one. So there are significant impacts on Russian digital industry. So sort of answered your question.
James, I think, was next.
Yeah.
James. Hello, James.
Hello.
My old colleague.
Yes.
Am I allowed to say that?
You mentioned the fact that there was a failure of communication between the Green Army and the Russian military intelligence. How much do you think plays in that there is a rivalry between the military intelligence and the FSB in these operations?
Yeah. So I'm sure it's fundamental. I mean, let's imagine that every time Russian military intelligence makes some big mistake, another Russian intelligence agency probably marches into the Kremlin and says, "You see, you should have left us in control." I'm sure there's that sort of rivalry that's going on, and it is playing a big part. There's probably something about the way authoritarian states work. I'm not going to pretend there's never been rivalry between intelligence agencies in a democracy, but it's resolved in fair and equitable ways.
More civilised ways.
More civilized.
Any more questions?
Do you think Russia really is isolated in defence of cyber, or is there a sharing tool between other hostile nations?
Sharing with other hostile nations. Well,
particularly adversaries in the UK.
So I'm not going to speculate too far. I mean, you could imagine. I think China's probably being very careful for obvious reasons. Are the Iranians providing some assistance? Is an interesting question. So I'm not. I think it's a really good question. I'm not going to speculate. I think Russia is largely isolated, and the sort of assistance it would get is from not the most sophisticated of cyber states in the world anyway. Which is, by the way, where I place North Korea.
But is it also true, I mean, European nations, the US in particular, have developed a cyber warfare type and cyber armies to help do it. My view on Russians and Iranians particularly is that they're being mainly commercial. That their need is primarily about foreign monies coming across the borders rather than developing tools that are weapons. Is that view completely wrong, or how do you...
So I think what you're describing in terms of financial stuff is definitely the concern of some of the Russian-based criminal groups. Disinformation and influence, and that's the sort of stuff that tries to influence elections in Western countries, is a really important part of the Gerasimov so-called doctrine that I referred to, and I would posit that yes, possibly Russia has not concentrated on the higher end military type capabilities. Possibly, as I argue, recognising that they are rather difficult to develop, which is why they tried to outlaw them under international law. So yes, the Russian doctrine envisaged the use of cyber operations as being most effective for them at thresholds below an armed conflict. That's what they were doing between 2014 and 2022 on Ukraine, I think trying to subvert the Ukrainian state without having to cross those thresholds. It wasn't working, so they then crossed the threshold. So whether they had therefore gone that extra step and thought how cyber operations work as an integrated part in a military campaign, perhaps they hadn't concentrated on that so hard, even though it is firmly in their doctrine. It is one of the lessons that I'm sure they're going to learn from this conflict, and so it might not be the same next time. Yeah.
One more.
Not about Ukraine. What's the one thing the CEO of business that's attending today or watching online, what's the one thing they could do when they get back to the office?
Think about how they approach cybersecurity as a board-level risk, asking the same sorts of questions that they would ask of other risks at that sort of level, to elevate the conversation beyond it's the technical thing that my technical people deal with and they assure me, to how, as a board can get the assurance that they need. Because the board has to find the language to have those conversations, because the board, this is all such serious stuff, the board needs to find the language to give it that level of assurance, the same sort of level of assurance as it would have for the company's financial bottom line.
On which note, ladies and gentlemen, we are bang on time, so please give thanks to Marcus. Thank you very much indeed.